Good Saturday morning, everybody. This morning we'll continue reading Hinds' Feet on High Places about the beloved story of Much Afraid and her exciting journey to the high places by Hannah Hernard. We're on chapter 17, The Healing Streams. Okay. When at last Much Afraid awoke, the sun was high in the sky, and she looked out through the mouth of the cave in which she found herself lying. Everything was shimmering in a blaze of radiant sunshine, which burnished every object with glory. She lay still a little longer, collecting her thoughts and trying to understand where she was. The rocky cave into which the sunbeams were pouring was warm and quiet and drenched with the sweet perfume of spikenard, frankincense, and myrrh. This perfume, she gradually realized, was emanating from the wrapping which covered her. She gently pushed back the folds, sat up, and looked about her. Then the memory of all that had happened returned to her. She and her two companions had come to a cloud-filled canyon high up on the mountains and to an altar of sacrifice. And the priest had wrenched out of her heart her flower of human love and burned it on the altar. On remembering that, she glanced down at her breast and saw it was covered with a cloth soaked in spices, whose perfume stole out and filled the cave with sweetness. She pushed the cloth aside a little curiously and was astonished to find no trace of a wound, not even a scar, nor was there any hint of pain or aching or stiffness anywhere in her body. Rising quickly, she went outside, then stood still and looked about her. The canyon, which had been so shrouded in mist that nothing had been distinguishable, now shimmered in the golden sunlight. Soft, verdant grass grew everywhere, starred with gentians, and other little jewel-like flowers of every variety. There were banks of sweet-smelling thyme, moss, and myrtle along the sides of the rocky walls, and everything sparkled with dew. In the center of the canyon, at a little distance from the cave, was a long stone altar to which she had been bound. But in the sunlight she saw that the flowers and mosses grew all about it and clothed its sides with verdure. Little birds hopped about here and there, scattering the dewdrops of the grasses and chirping merrily as they preened their plumage. One was perched on the altar itself, its little throat throbbing as it trilled forth a song of joy. But the most beautiful and wonderful thing of all was that out from under the rock altar there gushed a great river of water, clear as crystal. It then flowed in a series of cascades and through rocks, pools, right through the canyon, till it came to a broad lip of the rock, over which it poured with a noise of shouting and tremulous gladness. She was at the very source of the great fall, and knew now that it flowed from under the altar to which the priest had bound her. For some time she stood looking about her, her heart leaping and thrilling with growing joy, which was beyond her understanding, and a peace indescribably sweet, which seemed to enfold her. She was quite alone in the canyon. There were no signs of her companion's sorrow and suffering, nor of the priest of the altar. The only things which breathed and moved in the canyon beside herself were the cheerful little chirping birds and the insects and butterflies flitting among the flowers. High overhead was a cloudless sky, against which the peaks of the high places shone dazzlingly white. The first thing she did after she had taken in her surroundings was to step toward the river which gushed out from under the altar. It drew her irresistibly. She stooped down when she got to the bank and dabbled her fingers in the crystal water. It was icy cold, but it sent a shock of ecstasy tingling through her body. And without further delay, she put off the white linen robe she was wearing and stepped into one of the rocky pools. Never had she experienced anything so delicious and exhilarating. It was like immersing herself in a stream of bubbling life. When at last she stepped out of the pool, she was immediately dry and tingling from head to foot with a sense of perfect well-being. As she stood on the mossy bank by the pool, she happened to glance down and noticed for the first time that her feet were no longer crooked, ugly things which they always had been, but were straight feet, perfectly formed, shining white against the soft green grass. Then she remembered the healing streams of which the shepherd had spoken, which gushed out of the ground on the high places. Stepping straight back into the pool with a shock of the sweetest pleasure, and putting her head beneath the clear waters, she splashed them about her face. Then she found a little pool among the rocks, still and clear as a mirror. Kneeling down, she looked into its unruffled surface and saw her face quite clearly. It was true, the ugly, twisted mouth had vanished. The face she saw reflected back by the water was a relaxed and perfect as the face of a little child. After that, she began to wander about the canyon and noticed wild strawberries and blueberries and other small berries growing on the banks. She found a handful of these as refreshing and as sustaining a meal as ever she had eaten. Then she came to the lip of the rock cliff over which the river cast itself, and stood a long time watching the water as it leaped over the edge with the noise of its tremendous joy drowning every other sound. She saw how the sun glorified the crystal waters as they went swirling downward, and far below she saw the green Alps, where the shepherd had led her, and where they had stood at the foot of this same fall. She felt completely encompassed by peace, and a great inner quietness and contentment drowned every feeling of curiosity, loneliness, and anticipation. She did not think about the future at all. It was enough to be there in that quiet canyon, hidden away high up on the mountains, with a river of life flowing beside her, and to rest and recover herself after the long journey. After little, she lay down on a mossy bank and slept, and when she woke again, bathed herself in the river. So the long, quiet day passed like a sweet dream, while she rested and bathed and refreshed herself at intervals with the berries and then slept again. When at last the shadows lengthened, the sun sank in the west, and the snow peaks glowed glorious in rose and flame color, she went back into the cave, laid herself down among the spice-perfumed coverings, and slept as deeply and dreamlessly as she had the first night when the priest laid her there to rest.
Hinds' feet, chapter 18. On the third day, while it was still almost dark, she woke suddenly and sprang to her feet with a shock of joy tingling through her. She had not heard her name called, had not even been conscious of a voice. Yet she knew that she had been called. Some mysterious, sweet summons had reached her, a summons which she knew instinctively. She had been awaiting ever since she woke up for the first time in the cave. She stepped outside into the fragrant summer night. The morning star hung low in the sky, and in the east the first glimmer of dawn appeared. From somewhere close at hand, a solitary bird uttered one clear, sweet note, and a light breeze stirred over the grasses. Otherwise there was no sound, save the voice of the great waterfall. Then it came again, tingling through her call, tingling through her, a call ringing down from some high place above. Standing there in the pale dawn, she looked eagerly around. Every nerve in her body surged with desire to respond to the call, and she felt her feet and legs tingling with an almost irresistible urge to go bounding up the mountain. But where was the way out of the canyon? The walls seemed to rise smooth and almost perpendicular on all sides, except at the end, except at the end, which was blocked by the waterfall. Then, as she stood straining every nerve to find a possible means of exit up from a nearby mossy bank, sprang a mountain hart with the hind close behind him, just as she had seen them at the foot of the great precipice of injury. As she watched, the hart sprang onto the altar of rock, and from there, with a giant leap, he reached a projecting ledge on the wall on the farther side of the ravine. Then, closely followed by the hind, he began springing up the great wall of the canyon. Much afraid, did not hesitate one instant. In a moment, she was on the rock altar herself. The next, with a flying leap, she too reached the ledge on the wall. Then, using the same footholds as the hart and the hind, leaping and springing up in a perfect ecstasy of daylight, she followed them up the cliff, the hooves of the deer ringing on the rocks before her like little silver hammers. In a moment or two, all three were at the top of the canyon, and she was leaping up the mountainside toward the peak above, from which the summons had come. The rosy light in the east brightened. The snow on the summits of the mountain caught the glow and flushed like fire. And as she skipped and jumped from rock to rock excitedly, the first sunbeam streamed over the mountaintop. He was there, standing on the peak, just as she had known he would be, strong and grand and glorious in the bounty of the sunrise, holding out both hands and calling to her with a great laugh. You with the Hinds, feet jumping all over here. She gave one last flying spring, caught his hands, and landed beside him on the topmost peak of the mountain. Around them in every direction towered other and great ranges of snow mountains whose summits soared into the other great ranges of snow mountains whose summit roared into the sky higher than her sight could follow them. He was crowned and dressed in royal robes, just as she had seen him once before when he had carried her up to the high places and had touched her with the live coal from off the golden altar of love. Then his face had been stern in its majesty and gravity. Now it was alight with glory of joy, which excelled anything which she had ever imagined. At last, he said as she knelt speechless at his feet, at last you are here, and the night of weeping is over, and joy comes to you in the morning. Then lifting her up, he continued, this is the time when you are to receive the fulfillment of the promises. Never am I to call you much afraid again. At that he laughed again and said, I will write upon her a new name, the name of her God. The Lord God is a sun and shield, and the Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. Psalms 84:11. This is your new name, he declared. From henceforth you are grace and glory. She still could not speak, but stood silent with joy and thanksgiving and awe and wonder. Then he went on. Now for the flower of love, and for the promise that when it blooms you will be loved in return. Grace and glory spoke for the first time. My Lord and King, she said softly, there is no flower of love to bloom in my heart. It was burned to ashes on the altar at thy command. No flower of love, he repeated and laughed again so gently and joyfully that she could hardly bear it. That is strange, Grace and Glory. How then did you get here? You are right on the high places in the kingdom of love itself. Open your heart and let us see what is there. Yes, and at his word she laid bare her heart, and out came the sweetest perfume she'd ever breathed, and filled all the air around them with its fragrance. There in her heart was a plant whose shape and form could not be seen, because it was covered all over with pure white, almost transparent blooms from which the fragrance poured forth. Yes, Grace and Glory gave a little gasp of wonder and thankfulness. How did it get there, my Lord and King? She exclaimed. Well, I planted it there myself, was his laughing answer. Surely you remember, down there by the sheep pool in the valley of humiliation, on the day that you promised to go with me to the high places. It is the flower from the thorn-shaped seed. Then, my Lord, what was the plant which the priest tore out of my heart when I was bound to the altar? Do you remember, Grace and Glory, when you looked into your heart beside the pool and found that my kind of love was not there at all, only the plant of longing to be loved? She nodded wonderingly. That was the natural human love, which I tore out from your heart when the time was ripe and it was loose enough to be uprooted altogether, so that the real love, yes, the real love could grow there alone and fill your whole heart. You tore it out. You tore it out, she repeated slowly and wonderingly, and then, oh, my Lord and King, were you the priest? Were you there all the time when I thought you had forsaken me? He bowed his head and she took his hand in hers. The scarred hands. Oh, the scarred hands which had sworn, which had sown the thorn-shaped seed in her heart, and the hands with the grasp of steel, which had torn out the love which had been the cause of all of her pain, and kissed them while tears of joy on them.
And now, for the promise, said he, that when love flowers in your heart, you shall be loved again. Taking her hand in his, he said, behold, I have set my love upon thee, and thou art mine. Yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Jeremiah 31:3. After that, he said, give me the bag of stones of remembrance that you have gathered on your journey, Grace and Glory. She took it out and passed it to him, and then he bade her hold out her hands. On doing so, he opened the little purse and emptied the contents into her hands. Then she grasped again with bewilderment and delight, for instead of the common, ugly stones she had gathered from the altars along the way, there fell into her hands a heap of glorious, sparkling jewels, very precious and very beautiful. As she stood there, half dazzled by the glory of the flashing gems, she saw in his hand a circlet of pure gold. Oh, thou who wast afflicted, tossed with the tempest, and not comforted, he said, behold, I lay thy stones with fair colors. First he picked out of her hand one of the biggest and most beautiful of the stones, a sapphire, shining like the pavement of heaven, and set it in the center of the golden circlet. Then taking a fiery, blood-red ruby, he set it on one side of the sapphire, an emerald on the other. After that he took the other stones, 12 in all, and arranged them on the circlet, and set it upon her head. At that moment Grace and Glory remembered the cave in which she had sheltered from the floods, and how nearly she had succumbed to the temptation to discard as worthless those stones which now shone with glory and splendor in the crown upon her head. She remembered, too, the words which had sounded in her ears and had restrained her. Hold fast that thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Supposing she had thrown them away, had discarded her trust in his promises, had gone back on her surrenders to his will, there could have been no jewels. Now to his praise and glory, and no crown for her to wear. She marveled at the grace and love and tenderness and patience which had led and trained and guarded and kept poor faltering Much Afraid, which had not allowed her to turn back, and which now changed all her trials into glory. Then she heard him speaking again, and this time the smile on his face was almost more joyful than before. Hearken, O daughter, and consider, and incline thy ear. Forget also thine own people, and thy father's house. So shall the king greatly desire thy beauty, for he is thy Lord, and worship thou him. The king's daughter is all glorious within. She will be brought into the king in clothing of wrought gold, in raiment of needlework. The virgins, her companions that follow her, shall be brought unto thee. With gladness and rejoicing shall they be brought. They shall enter into the king's palace. Psalms 45:10-15. Then he added, now that you are to live with me here on the high places, to go where I go, and to share my work in the valley below, it is fitting, Grace and Glory, that you should have companions and handmaidens, and I will bring them to you. At that, Grace and Glory regarded him earnestly, and there were almost tears in her eyes, for she remembered suffering and sorrow, the faithful companions who he had given to her before, and had been through their help and gentleness and patience. She had been able to ascend to the mountains to the high places. All the time she had been with her Lord and King, receiving her new name and being crowned with joy and glory. She had been thinking of them and wishing, yes, actually wishing and longing that they were there too. For why should she receive everything? They had endured the same journey, had supported and helped her, had begun through the same trials and attacks of the enemy. Now she was here, and they were not. She opened her mouth to make her first request, to beg her Lord to let her keep the companions he had chosen in the beginning, and who had brought her to the glory of the high places. Before she could speak, however, he said with the same specially lovely smile, "Here are the handmaidens, Grace and Glory, whom I have chosen to be with you henceforth and forevermore." Two radiant, shining figures stepped forward, the morning sunshine glittering on their snowy garments, making them dazzling to look at. They were taller and stronger than Grace and Glory, but it was the beauty of their faces and the love shining in their eyes which caught at her heart and made her almost tremble with joy and admiration. They came toward her, their faces shining with mirth and gladness, but they said not a word. "Who are you?" asked Grace and Glory softly. "Will you tell me your names?" Instead of answering, they looked at one another and smiled, then held out their hands as though to take hers in their own. At that familiar gesture, Grace and Glory knew them and cried out with a joy which was almost more than she could bear. "Why, you are suffering in sorrow. Oh, welcome, welcome. I was longing to find you again." They shook their heads. "Oh, no," they laughed. "We are no more suffering and sorrow than you are much afraid. Don't you know that everything that comes to the high places is transformed? Since you brought us here with you, we are turned into joy and peace." "Brought you here?" gasped Grace and Glory. "What an extraordinary way to express it. Why, from the first to the last, you dragged me here." Again they shook their heads and smiled as they answered, "No, we could never have come here alone, Grace and Glory. Suffering and sorrow may not enter the kingdom of love, but each time you accepted us and put your hands in ours, we began to change. Had you turned back or rejected us, we never could have come here." Looking at one another again, they laughed softly and said, "When first we saw you at the foot of the mountains, we felt a little depressed and despairing. You seemed so much afraid of us and shrank away and would not accept our help. And it looked so unlikely that any of us would ever get to the high places. We told ourselves that we would have to remain sorrow and suffering always. But you see how graciously our Lord the King arranged for all of us, and you did bring us here. Now we are to be your companions and friends forever." With that, they came up to her, put their arms around her, and all three embraced and kissed one another with a love and thankfulness and joy beyond words to express. So with a new name, and united to the King, and crowned with glory, Grace and Glory, accompanied by her companions and friends, came to the high places and was led into the kingdom of love.